Pokémon, the wildly successful phenomenon that didn't just sweep Japan, but the entire world, released to Japan in 1996 and other parts of the world from 1998 to 1999. It was a smash hit with an anime and manga, films, trading cards, and video game spin-offs later released to the N64. Since then, the franchise has only grown, with system-selling sequels and the highly popular Pokemon Go released in 2016. But where did it come from? Whose creative vision was behind the franchise? And what were the creative steps it took to make such a highly regarded property? What's up, guys? I'm Dave Klein, and today we're going to take a look at who made Pokemon. It all began with a bug-catching child who was raised in the Tokyo suburb of Machida, Japan, Satoshi Tajiri. The place where I grew up, in Machida, a western Tokyo suburb, was still rural back then. There were rice paddies, rivers, forests. It was full of nature. As Satoshi Tajiri was born in 1965 and there weren't any video games, especially in his childhood home, kids had to find other activities to entertain themselves. One of these activities was catching bugs, which Satoshi Tajiri was particularly fascinated by, earning him the childhood nickname of Dr. Bug. They fascinated me. For one thing, they kind of moved funny. They were odd. Every time I found a new insect, it was mysterious to me, and the more I searched for insects, the more I found. If I put my hand in the river, I would get a crayfish. If there was a stick over a hole, it would create an air bubble, and I'd find insects there. I usually took them home. As I gathered more and more, I learned about them, like how some would feed on one another, so I stopped bringing them home. I collected them obsessively to the point where I was like a bug professor. This all changed, as did Satoshi Tajiri's interests, as his suburban hometown modernized. Then development started taking place, and as it grew, all the insects were driven away. Every year they would cut down trees and the population of insects would decrease. The change was dramatic. A fishing pond would become an arcade center. With the arcade centers, Tajiri's interests were replaced by video games, in particular, the 1978 release of Space Invaders. In my second year of junior high, there was a Space Invaders boom. That's when I got hooked, you could say. He would spend all of his time and money going to these arcade centers, oftentimes to the concern of his parents. I could easily spend 1,000, 2,000 yen in junior high each time I went to the arcade, and in Machida, each game cost 100 yen. While I don't know the exact comparison of how much 100 yen was compared to the US dollar in 1978, today, 100 yen is roughly equal to $1 US, meaning that if it were today, Satoshi Tajiri would be spending $10 to $20 each time he went to the arcade. In Japan, it had become commonplace for children to go to cram school. However, even this Satoshi Tajiri planned around video games. And for the following quote, I got from a Google Translated Nintendo article, so I cleaned up the translation myself with the original article in the description. Of course, I would go to cram school when I was of age to study for exams, but since I wanted to play video games rather than studying, I chose a cram school where a game center was nearby. So during cram school's 15-minute break, I would run to the game center, play Missile Command, then hurry back. According to a couple articles in Time, Satoshi Tajiri was so obsessed with arcades, he would skip out of classes to play games while he was in high school. In fact, a teacher called his father to inform him that Satoshi didn't have enough credits to graduate, so his father called a friend at the Tokyo Power Company to get Satoshi a job as an electrical utility repairman, but Satoshi refused. He did eventually take makeup courses to graduate, and eventually went to a 2-year technical school to study electronics instead of traditional college, but his parents were worried about him. It was as simple as shoplifting. My parents cried that I had become a delinquent. In spite of this, Satoshi Tajiri found a way to turn his passion into money in 1982 with the first edition of Game Freak, a fanzine he created in order to give players hints and tips when they were playing games at the arcade. The first edition featured Big Doug on the cover, with everything being handwritten and hand-drawn by Satoshi himself, with him even stapling together the photocopied fanzines he would sell. In the early 80s, there was a time when no video game media existed, and as someone who goes to arcades, I wanted to somehow express to others how fun they are, so I decided to make something by hand. There was a store that sold fanzines and mini comics next to books. I would go to that store that sells handmade books and have them display about 5 issues of Game Freak I photocopied. He would sell these for 200 yen each, in other words, the cost of playing 2 games at an arcade. He would then use that money he'd earned on Game Freak sales and spend it right back in the arcade playing more games, and getting more info for the next issue of Game Freak. Game Freak did surprisingly well, and would regularly sell out, even earning a fan base. His most successful issue was a special on Xevious, and partly by luck. After the game came out, he made his issue on Xevious Strategies, which did okay, but another kid around his age had managed to get 10 million points a week after Xevious was released. Namco was so surprised, they went, "We want to meet this amazing kid, let's invite him over," and they did. Then they gave him the materials needed to make the book. He began selling a strategy book that came with a map. While this might have completely overtaken Game Freak's edition on Xevious, by a stroke of luck, Satoshi was contacted by the kid who had scored 10 million points with a proposal. He proposed, "If you're doing Game Freak, do you want to publish the Xevious book together?" And at the time, he was studying for exams. Third-year senior high exams. His parents found out he was sneaking off to go to arcades, so his head was shaved bald. He said it would be bad if he kept this up. He couldn't game until exams were over, so I agreed to sell it through Game Freak. That's how his book later came to be published through Game Freak. The strategy guide on its own had sold 5,000 copies, and through Game Freak, it sold 10,000 more copies. Satoshi was so busy with mail orders, he needed the help of his family in order to keep up with demand. To be frank, I struggled with this book far more. When those orders came every day, I was happy they sold, but I'd then have to mail each one. They were just strategy guides, but I mailed them with such force, like my life was ending. With my family, my little sister would put them in envelopes. Around this time, Sega had started hosting a TV Game Idea Awards, where competitors would present game ideas, and the main winners would walk away with a split 500,000 yen prize pool. They had Game Idea Awards, sort of a contest for game ideas. Winners received 500,000 yen and their ideas were turned into games. I bought a PC 8000, an old computer. With that, I learned how to program my own games. In junior high, I had dreams of making a sequel to Invaders. Dreams like, what would happen if I make my own games? I took my very first step towards it. While Satoshi only won an award for effort his first year entering, the second year he won the grand prize, including 100,000 yen. I won with something called Spring Stranger. It starred a character with a round body and had a comical touch. A dancer would go down a maze-like path, and there were spikes along the way. By pulling a lever, it would hop to the side. Depending on whether it would hop once or twice, it would or wouldn't land on the spikes. It goes down the course like that. Starting to get a grasp in programming, and gaining notoriety in the gaming scene with Game Freak, another important factor came with Ken Sugimori contacting him via Game Freak. According to Chris Kohler's book, Power Up, How Japanese Video Games Gave the World an Extra Life, an otaku named Ken Sugimori saw the first issue of Tajiri's fanzine, called Game Freak, in a doujinshi store in Shinjuku. Recognizing a kindred spirit, he wrote to Tajiri and included some of his illustrations, asking if he could write for Game Freak. The two became fast friends and eventually started experimenting with game design. While it would be a while before Sugimori worked full-time for Game Freak, with aspirations to become a mangaka, he would become a major force within Game Freak. Pretty soon I had some contributors, and we'd all get together and talk about games. The more I learned about games, the more frustrated I became because the games weren't very good. I could tell a good game from a bad game. My conclusion was, let's make our own games. While still working on and publishing Game Freak, Satoshi Tajiri worked on his very first game, Quinty, known in the States as Mendel Palace. He thought, with Namco, games typically had a theme. For example, with Dig Dug, the theme was to dig. I felt the same joy I had in junior high when I learned new English verbs. That inspired me to use verbs as themes, so I wanted to make a new fixed screen game based on a new verb, a new idea. As a result, I came up with the idea of flipping. Like when you flip the tile, the floor gets slippery. I thought, what happens when you translate that into a game? It's honestly unclear to me who programmed the game. Game Center CX showed Satoshi's pitch document for Quinty, where he received notes and comments from a programmer saying, "I don't get it." Alternatively, in an interview with Time, he states he programmed the game himself, stating, "I didn't rely on other companies or programmers. I just started taking apart the Nintendo system to see how it worked. When I was 16, I won a contest Sega was sponsoring for a game idea. It took me 2 years to learn the programming and a year to make my first game called Quinty." That said, in the credits of Quinty, Yuji Shingai is credited as the programmer, so perhaps something was lost in translation for the Time interview. And speaking of credits, Ken Sugimori was the character designer for the game, and Junichi Masuda, who would go on to write the music for Pokemon, wrote the music for Quinty as well. Quinty was completed in 1989 after 3 years of work, leading Satoshi to pitch the completed game to a publisher. After many repeated plays, I contacted Namco. I said, "I made a game, I'd like to show it to you," and took it to them. Today, it would be unheard of. Normally, if you want to make a game, you present it to the game company, and if they approve, they give you the funds. Then you make it. It's uncommon to go, "I made one, so have a look." Namco was so impressed with Satoshi's pitch that they accepted the game and proposal right there during the pitch meeting. The game sold well in Japan, and according to Power Up, Satoshi Tajiri then went to California believing he could sell the game in the US, driving along the coast pitching the game to various publishers. Quinty was rejected for being too cute by most of them. Finally, the US arm of Hudson Soft picked up the game and released it as Mendel Palace in the US, altering the title screen and package art so that the game's characters, while still anime-styled, were more realistically proportioned and less cute. The actual in-game graphic style was unchanged. Thanks to the success of Quinty, Game Freak became a corporation in 1989. Also in 1989, the Game Boy was released to Japan. The Game Boy was different from the NES in that it was both handheld, and with the Game Boy Link cable, for the first time ever, players could link their systems together and trade information between games. And it was exactly this that gave Satoshi Tajiri an idea. I saw Game Boy when it was first released. The idea for Pokemon clicked in my mind. The basic idea for Pokemon seemed a good fit for Game Boy. It was the communication aspect of Game Boy. It was a profound image to me. It has a communication cable. In Tetris, its first game, the cable transmitted information about moving blocks. The cable really got me interested. I thought of actual living organisms moving back and forth across the cable. In Dragon Quest II, I believe, when I played that, one equipment had an extremely low chance of appearing. You were lucky if you found it. Rather, a monster would drop it. It was called the Magic Hat, and by wearing it, you could cast spells, with MP cost reduced, with that hat. And, well, our graphic artist, Sugimori, had 2 of them. I didn't have one. It's valuable because it's so rare, yet I didn't have one and Sugimori had 2. And I thought, is there any way for me to get it from him? I talked to him about it a lot. Nothing could be done. They were separate carts after all. So having experienced that desire to receive the Magic Hat, as soon as I saw the Game Boy's link cable capabilities, I thought, oh, that's it! With this cable you can exchange hats. With this inkling of an idea, in 1990, Satoshi Tajiri brought a pitch to none other than Nintendo. At the time, it was very different from the Pokemon we know today, but the idea was still there. At the time, it was called Capsule Monsters, and was far more of a dungeon crawl RPG. In his proposal to Nintendo, he writes a hypothetical future in which kids are exchanging creatures with each other after collecting them. In Capsule Monsters, 200 types of virtual monsters live in equally virtual underground dungeons on the Game Boy. The game's hero can befriend these monsters and win them over to his side by increasing his charisma, a game parameter not yet widely known among Japanese audiences. The roster of over 200 types of monsters includes creatures that you won't necessarily encounter, creatures who will choose not to ally with you, and creatures who you'll miss the chance to encounter entirely and thus never be able to catch. He then details a hypothetical discussion between friends at school who negotiate a trade between rare green dragons, fireflies, and power kings. Takuji and I finally finished negotiating. He'd agreed to trade one of his fireflies for 2 of my green dragons, but I still felt like our exchange was a little unbalanced. I asked if he wouldn't mind adding 5 Power Kings, monsters with the strength you might expect to see in soldiers, and we finally struck a bargain. Power Kings have a high encounter rate, and you'll quickly run into them if you wander around dungeons. They're strong though, and the theory is that, if you have a lot of them, you can put them to work as soldiers when you run into monsters. Finally, he concludes with a prediction that through the word of mouth from kids wanting to trade with each other, the game will become a hit. While he would eventually be right, Nintendo didn't feel like Game Freak was ready to tackle such a project yet. So Shigesato Itoi made something called Ape with Nintendo, a collaborative company, and in Tokyo he went, anyone who wants to make a game with Nintendo, here's your chance. So I took the idea of Pokemon to Mr. Itoi there, and they were going to make it, but they said it would take some time to complete. So they went, Mr. Yokoi of Nintendo plans on making a game about Yoshi. So Mr. Ishihara said, by first creating a game with a short production period such as Yoshi's Egg or Mario and Wario, we will improve various aspects such as the company's cash flow and the staff's ability. It gave me a proposal of let's go to Pocket Monsters. For study purposes with one idea, one package, I completed Yoshi in half a year. With gameplay advice from none other than Nintendo's Gunpei Yokoi, Satoshi Tajiri and Game Freak were able to turn Yoshi into a hit. The game sold over 500,000 copies on its first day and helped prove Tajiri could make a successful game. With Quinty, I used my boiling passion to surpass something else. This time, I made something with a completely different approach. As a human being, it was a valuable experience, so to speak. Yoshi opened the door to my career. That's what I believe. According to his interview with the Japanese show Game Center CX, he began work on Pokemon after Yoshi. However, there were several other titles he worked on in between the 1991 release of Yoshi and the 1996 release of Pokemon. These include Magical Taruruto-Kun on the Sega Mega Drive, Mario and Wario on the Super Nintendo, and Pulseman on the Sega Mega Drive. It's possible this was mainly to help keep Game Freak afloat while they worked on Pokemon, as according to an article published in Time, during the 6 years it took Tajiri to finish Pokemon, Game Freak nearly went broke. For several months, Tajiri-san barely had enough money to pay employees. 5 people quit when he told them how dire the financial conditions were. Tajiri didn't pay himself but lived off his father. Either way, development on Pokemon had officially begun. One thing I want to mention before moving on is that some sources seem to have linked Satoshi Tajiri's fascination with bugs to him having Asperger's syndrome. That said, in all of my research, I haven't been able to find any actual real source for this claim. There have been multiple articles written, such as how Satoshi Tajiri's autism helped create Pokemon, which makes the claim he has it because people with autism tend to have fixations and specializations, and you can see them in his past actions. However, I find it a little messed up people have internet diagnosed him with it without any actual source or mention from him, especially the number of online articles I've found stating this without a single credible source. In the biography, Satoshi Tajiri Pokemon Creator, by Lori Mortensen, it's claimed he has Asperger's syndrome. I emailed Lori myself asking what her source was, and she responded she'd received the information from a MySpace page, and the publisher decided to omit this from the book as it wasn't an age-appropriate site for children. She goes on to state, at the time, she believed it was his personal page, but it's completely possible someone was pretending to be him, and it was an erroneous assumption on her part. Funny enough, a lot of the articles spreading this claim use a photo of Tsunekazu Ishihara, so that's an easy way to tell how much research they did. To be clear, it's not something that matters to me either way. I'm primarily trying to provide the most accurate information I can, and I find it amazing how widespread this rumor is when I can't find a single reputable source. So, from my research, it seems to be a widespread misnomer with no real empirical evidence. It's one of those things that sounds like a good trivia factoid, so it's spread, but if anyone has a reputable first-hand or second-hand source that states he does, please share in the comments and I'll make sure to pin it if I agree. In creating Pokemon, Satoshi Tajiri thought deeply about what players would actually want to trade with each other and what might have value to them. I asked myself questions. What, through link play, would make me think, I want that? What would stir such emotions in me the best? For example, aside from Pokemon, there's money. If Pikachu was 1,000 yen and you sold him, what would you think? Would you think 1,000 yen is a good deal? That way, naturally, the Pokemon could have different abilities, or they can evolve and change, or they look strong. These qualities are easy to understand and everyone would desire them the same way. When you trade, if you can see, so that's how this guy raised his, you can even have fun trading the same Pokemon. He also used collecting bugs as a child to serve as inspiration. Places to catch insects are rare because of urbanization. Kids play inside their homes now, and a lot had forgotten about catching insects. So had I. When I was making games, something clicked, and I decided to make a game with that concept. Everything I did as a kid is kind of rolled into one. That's what Pokemon is. Playing video games, watching TV, Ultraman with his capsule monsters. They all became ingredients for the game. With the idea in place, there was still plenty of work to do. In fact, at first the game primarily focused on catching dinosaurs. There also were no types. At first, Pokemon were more dinosaur-like than the ones you see today. Beginning the story of choosing one of 3 Pokemon of different types was also something that came about in the middle of development. It's pretty common at our company to have a game change completely during the development period. We had at least 10 different scenarios just for the opening sequence. The game, as mentioned before, was also initially more of a dungeon crawl. The focus of the game didn't change until partway through development. At first, the game was more RPG-like. It was only in the middle of development that the goal of the game became completing your Pokédex. That's when memory capacity and deciding on a good number of characters became an issue. We actually wanted to have more. We designed around 1.5 times more characters than we actually used. When we were writing the text for the Pokédex, we started talking about how fun it was to collect Pokémon. We hadn't wanted to do a fantasy RPG from the start. We felt a story about a boy traveling to fill up his Pokédex was more appropriate for modern times than this tale of a hero battling an evil villain. The player character could also initially attack similar to Pokemon. However, this idea was dropped as it made the concept of having Pokemon feel pointless if you could fight on your own. As this concept grew, the story evolved into where you were friends with your Pokemon as opposed to them just being like pets. Since they were meant to be friends, we made it so that each player could raise a Pokemon and develop its personality. That's why they can only learn 4 moves. When deciding on what sort of moves he wants his Pokemon to have, the owner's personality will come out. We designed it so that you'd feel your Pokemon were something that belonged to you, friends to you. In fact, this aspect was so important to them, it seems like this is, in part, why you could only have 1 save file in the original Pokemon. We had the idea of being able to name your Pokemon from the very beginning. We were discussing whether it would be better to have 3 save files or to be able to name all 151 of your Pokemon, and everyone was unanimous in saying it's better to be able to name them all. When it came time to actually creating and conceptualizing the Pokemon, the entire staff was involved in the process. Everyone who worked at Game Freak thought of their own ideal Pokemon. We had about 300 ideas after brainstorming, and we voted here for the most popular ones. After the concept of dinosaurs, the first Pokemon created were with the concept of Pokemon who lived alongside humans. The first Pokemon were Rhydon, Clefairy, and Lapras. At first, we planned to have Pokemon living alongside humans, making their lives easier. So during the early stages of development, many of the characters we came up with had clear roles, like carrying things around or sailing across the sea with people on their backs. We also thought up cute pet-like characters like Clefairy. It was, however, thanks to the battles that Pokemon of various types came about. The team felt that the battles would get boring if there were just strong and weak Pokemon, and thus they devised types in order to give the game more depth. They also focused on making certain Pokemon more rare to find in order to make them more collectible. If we hadn't made a certain number of rare Pokemon, no one would want to collect them. To that end, we made sure there were a few Pokemon that would be difficult to catch. The Pokemon that resemble familiar creatures you'd find around you in the real world appear quite frequently. That means Pokemon like Pikachu are harder to find. With the 151 Pokemon finalized, Ken Sugimori illustrated all of the final designs. According to Tetsuya Watanabe, who is the director of programming on Pokemon, the large number of Pokemon weren't particularly hard to program in, but it was fine-tuning everything that was the most challenging. Satoshi Tajiri was in charge of the basics of Pokemon levels, but I was the one that fine-tuned the balance. I begin by looking at a picture of a Pokemon and asking myself, how strong would this Pokemon be? Deciding its level from there. Then I'd playtest it and readjust this level if it wasn't fun enough. Wash, rinse, repeat. There were also times when I'd have to decide on a character and level based on what was necessary for the story at the time. As production neared completion, it was actually Shigeru Miyamoto who suggested the game be turned into two different versions, red and green. In the beginning, the original Pokemon didn't have different variations such as red and blue. I took the advice of Miyamoto and split it into two, something that was a first for us. I didn't suggest splitting the games because it would allow us to sell more copies of the same thing. I just thought it would be more fun for the players if, say, there were 3 siblings and they all owned something unique. That way, they'd be able to communicate. I didn't want to release separate versions of the games just to increase marketability. When the game was finally near completion, the team ran into a couple major problems, and surprisingly, actually viewed the rare Pokemon Mew as being part of the success of the game. We originally completed the titles in October of the year prior to their release, 1995, and wanted to release them quickly, but we missed the end-of-year sales season and finally released the games at the end of February of the following year, the very worst time of year to release games. Game Boy's popularity was declining. Just when I finished the game and took it to Nintendo, I felt like a baseball player who slides into second base even though you know you're going to be out, but then it turns out you're safe. What's more, at that time, there was the slight sense in the air that Game Boy might have reached the end of its shelf life, wasn't there? That's why I had this feeling that perhaps we were going to miss the last train. After all, we dragged it out until the very end of the console's lifespan. I recall, the initial number of units to be shipped was smaller than I'd expected, but even so, I had quite high expectations. With the number of units, I imagined that they'd fly out of the shops and that stock would run dry very quickly, but sadly, that wasn't to be. I remember looking at the weekly sales figures and feeling that we were just hovering around the edges of the top 10. The game sales were slow to start. However, as Satoshi Tajiri had predicted in his 1991 Capsule Monsters pitch to Nintendo, the game picked up sales every month thanks to word of mouth. In part, this was thanks to the mysterious Pokemon Mew, who had been added last minute, even after all the testing was done by programmer Shigeki Morimoto. We put Mew in right at the very end. The cartridge was really full and there wasn't room for much more on there. Then the debug features which weren't going to be included in the final version of the game were removed, creating a minuscule 300 bytes of free space. So we thought that we could slot Mew in there. What we did would be unthinkable nowadays. What's the point of going through all the trouble of the debug process if you're going to go and fiddle with the game afterwards? I'd venture that this all came from Morimoto-san's mischievous nature. Well, it was a prank that everyone, right up to Tajiri-san, was in on, but even though Mew was in there, it wasn't actually supposed to appear in the game, right? Right, unless we could think about any good opportunity to do so, the existence of Mew wouldn't have been revealed to the public. It was left in there in case it was suitable for some post-launch activity, but if there wasn't anyone among ourselves who wanted to use it, I thought it would be fine to just leave it as it was. But then, due to an unforeseen bug, Mew ended up appearing in some players' games. It looked like we planned all of this, but that wasn't the case. So although it caused all sorts of problems to many concerned, fortunately enough, it ended up having a positive effect. It was thanks to this Mew bug, rumors began circulating through word of mouth and excitement grew over the character. Thanks to this, in April 1996, Game Freak and Koto Comic came up with a legendary Pokemon offer. Through this, readers could submit to Koto Comic for a chance to win Mew on their game cartridge. 20 winners would be selected, who could then send in their game cartridge and have Game Freak transfer the data to them. 78,000 people ended up submitting for a chance to win. There was a really incredible response to the Koro Koro Comics announcement of the Mew offer. I feel like that's really when things turned around for Pokemon. I believe so too. The monthly sales we'd had up to then began to be equaled by weekly sales, before increasing to become 3, then 4 times larger. By the time it ranked number 1 in weekly sales, more than a year and a half had gone by since the game was first released. While some had high hopes for Pokemon, nobody on the team predicted it would become such a massive hit, nor that there would be merchandise or an anime series. In the beginning, we were so ecstatic when anything Pokemon related was released, we collected ourselves. I was hitting the gachapon machines hard. We tell ourselves, there are 151, so we've gotta catch them all, even though we were the ones that made them. With Pokemon becoming such a major success in Japan, and in retrospect, it seems inevitable it would make its way across the shore internationally, but that wasn't really the case. Nintendo of America had their doubts about how successful the franchise would be in the States. They were concerned as RPGs didn't sell well in the West, especially on the Game Boy. We had a real concern that the role-playing nature of the game would be a hard sell for us. Nintendo America was also afraid that the cutesy characters wouldn't appeal to American children, and suggested using muscular characters instead. We were sent a proposal of muscle-bound characters to use if we wanted to do well in the US. Apparently, according to Kotaku, Hiroshi Yamauchi shot this down, feeling the difference could be appealing to American gamers, and thought it would be a good challenge to take. Nintendo of America ended up doing a major push for Pokemon before it was released. The anime came to American televisions prior to the Game Boy release, airing early September 1998, with the game itself releasing September 28, 1998. Additionally, the game was prominently featured in Nintendo Power. While I can't check the source on this, according to Wikipedia, the book Pikachu's Global Adventure, The Rise and Fall of Pokemon, states that Nintendo allegedly spent over $50 million to promote the games. In spite of all of this, and the major success of Pokemon in Japan, Nintendo of America still couldn't foresee just how major of a success it would be in the States. When we started Pokemon, my sentiment was this: because it was such a complicated property, Nintendo needed to have a separate group doing the whole thing, and that if I was going to do this, I would need a larger area of responsibility. At the same time, and I'm a little embarrassed to say this now, but I didn't think it was going to be enough of a challenge. I knew it meant I had to interface and coordinate with Japan, but I didn't expect it to be that big. Pokemon absolutely blew up, with astounding worldwide sales. Combined, the game sold over 10.4 million copies in Japan, over 9.85 million copies in the US, and over 3.56 million copies in the UK. The Pokemon craze took the world by storm, and still continues to be a highly successful franchise to this very day. All of this, thanks to Satoshi Tajiri combining his passions of video games and collecting bugs. Mr. Tajiri didn't start this project intending to make something which would become very popular. He just wanted to make something he wanted to play himself. There was no business sense involved, only his love involved in the creation. Somehow, what he wanted to create for himself was appreciated by others in this country and is shared by people in other countries. Well, that was a ridiculously long episode and took forever to edit. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I used a lot of quotes this time around, as I usually do, just because I want to really make sure that it's as accurate as humanly possible. And I know I talked a lot about Satoshi Tajiri, but I found it fascinating, his history and how he went from who he was to building Game Freak and how that turned into a game company. And I also find it kind of inspirational. I hope that you guys did too. Before I wrap this up, a huge thank you to all of my Patreon contributors. Thank you so much, One-Eyed Sniper, Richard Sun, Dark Sun Rebel, Aslish, Invidentia, Ryan Drawn, Marcus Roston, Jason Buck, and everyone else who helped contribute. If you'd like to vote on the next Who Made video, please consider supporting me on Patreon, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.